Great, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you again for spending an evening with us on Zoom. I know a lot of you have probably had 50 Zoom meetings over the course of the week, over the course of perhaps even today. So the fact that you would spend another hour with us on Zoom is really meaningful. We're talking about, I feel, a topic that is meaningful to all of us. And let's jump into it just so that we use our time wisely. We do need to acknowledge our sponsors. Of course, wonderful ZAP program is the sponsor of Preservation Utah and makes these programs possible, as does the George S. and Dolores Ray Eccles Foundation. Our Preservation Utah Board of Trustees and our members are also key supporters of this type of programming of our organization. It's these people that make the organization sing and hum and allow us to do what we do. So thank you all members, thank you all board members who are on the call especially. And then for our 55th birthday week, which is of course this week, as many of you know, we have a sponsor in Old House Care. This is our friend John Sargent, who has restored many a house in the avenues in Capitol Hill. And he has been willing to match any donation that we received during this birthday week up to $1,000. So if you haven't joined or if you haven't donated to us this year, even if you have, of course, we are more than happy to receive your generosity and also the generosity of Old House Care, who will match your donations. So we really appreciate all of these people. Thank you to our supporters. While I have a group of captive people, I do also want to talk a little bit about our advocacy. We have, in addition to events coming up, we have a variety of advocacy opportunities for all of us to get involved with. For the last really 5 years, Preservation Utah has been advocating to save the Utah State Penitentiary in Draper. Many of you know that the penitentiary will move out of Draper and head to a place, an area, a new building constructed by the Salt Lake City Airport. We're advocating to save the old penitentiary that was built in the mid-century, mid-20th century. If you have questions about this, why we would want to save the old penitentiary, do not hesitate to ask me. That sort of a conversation for another day. But if we could get as many preservationists out to this open house that the Point of the Mountain Commission is holding on Thursday, August 12th, to speak about the value of preservation generally, to talk about how interesting it would be to reuse the prison for new and exciting purposes. We would appreciate everyone supporting us in that effort. We'll certainly be there. We hope to see you there as well. And then our friends at the Historic Murray First Foundation are also asking us to announce that an open house will be held in Murray on August 25th at the Murray Senior Center. I don't know if many of you have followed what's happened in Murray over the past couple of years. The current administration, the mayoral administration, gutted the historic preservation ordinance in Murray, and they are now planning to tear down the core of Murray, of historic Murray, there along State Street. And we think that's a valuable contribution, of course, not just to Murray, but to the whole Salt Lake Valley. It's one of those stretches along State Street that really speaks to a past where a lot of the State Street doesn't, the State Street corridor doesn't. You know you're in a place when you reach Murray and you reach that stretch of State Street. We're really anxious to see that preserved. So as many of you that could go and attend that meeting alongside us and advocate for the retention of historic Murray's business core, we would greatly appreciate it. We hope to see you there at that event as well. All right, well, with no further ado, let's launch into the Utah Pantages Theater discussion. It's past, present, and future. Does it have a future? I guess that's the big question that we'll get to sooner or later in this presentation. I like to give, when I give lectures, I like to give people an idea of where I'm going to take them, a flow of what will be presented. I'm going to really start out by comparing the Eccles and the Utah theaters and discuss how those two theaters really play different roles. And especially in the case of the Utah theater, the role that the Utah theater was designed to play, was built to play, which really extends out of theater history. The types of theaters the Utah Pantages Theater referenced, the type of theater that architecture references, is really rooted in history. And in order to understand how that building was constructed, how it was meant to work, you have to understand that past. Then we're going to talk about the construction of the theater itself, and then its later 20th and now 21st century history. So let's jump in and talk about the Eccles Theater. We have on October 21st, 2016, the ribbon cutting for the Eccles Theater. It's interesting to read those old articles that talk about the role that the Eccles Theater was designed to play, even from the initial stages of its design, ultimately to the finished building that we have in downtown Salt Lake today. This is from a Salt Lake Tribune article that was published on October 21st in 2016. We have this clip that says, many praise the former Salt Lake City Mayor Ralph Becker, who spent much of his 8-year tenure pushing his vision for a regional theater that would bolster the city's reputation as an art center, but also act as an economic engine that would enliven downtown. And that's really the role that the Eccles Theater was designed to play, to support the arts, but also, importantly, to act as an economic engine. So when the architects of this theater designed the theater, they really put the majority of space available on that lot into the auditorium itself. This is the public lobby. You go through these stairways to get to the various tiers of the auditorium, and then you're in the auditorium itself. And the idea behind the theater is that you go to the theater to watch a play or a performance or a musical or whatever happens to be on tap the night that your ticket allows you entrance into the building. In fact, that's another point that this article made, that when this theater was inaugurated, they had this performance with Brian Stokes Mitchell, Megan Hilty, other stars, including local companies, Ryrie Woodbury Dance Company, and the tickets cost $102. And the idea behind that ticket price, which most of us would consider to be a high ticket price, was that what you were going to see there at the opening night and subsequent nights at the Eccles was worth that money. When you look at the Pantages Theater, what you have is quite a different building. You have a building with a long snorkel entrance that has a very grand lobby. This is actually quite a large space for those of you who have actually been inside the Utah Theater. And then you have the auditorium. So the auditorium is something that you don't access quickly, but you access through a processional space, a large amount of public space, which is really there for two reasons. The first reason there was so much public space given to the design of the Pantages Theater is because Alexander Pantages, who was a consummate businessman, realized that by putting the theater at the center of our famously large blocks here in Salt Lake, he was able to use inexpensive land at the heart of the block, and he was ultimately able to activate the land that was part of his theater parcel closest to the street with shops and stores that would provide rent. But another reason why there was so much public space given to this theater is because when you went to a vaudeville theater of this sort, the assumption was that you did not just go to see a play or the performance or the song and dance that was on stage that night. You went there to socialize. That these old theaters really were not just places of performance, of artistic performance, but they were also places where society would perform, where society would present itself. Whereas my advisor said, he always talked about the important role that buildings of this vintage played in the display of social identity and sociability. When you read articles that talk about the role that the Pantages was meant to play in Salt Lake, these are articles that are published shortly after the building was constructed, you get that sense reinforced in the language that these articles use. You have articles that talk about the comfort that you would experience when you go to the Pantages Theater. You have the comfort of the actors. You have the comfort of people who needed to use facilities when they went to the Pantages Theater. Even the sanitary systems were discussed, the plumbing. gets a whole article. You've got articles that talk a lot about the work that went in, the craftsmanship that went into creating the spaces, the public spaces in the auditorium, and how extremely refined all of these spaces were. In fact, that's what it says here in this article that talks about how the Salt Lake will be sisters to the world's most beautiful theater and the complement to that world's most beautiful theater, which they refer to as the Hollywood Pantages. When the Salt Lake House was finished, it's not only a twin sister to the most beautiful theater, which is again the Hollywood Pantages Theater in the context of the article, but it had even more refinements. The Salt Lake Theater was even more refined than the vaudeville house that Pantages had built in Hollywood prior to his construction of the Pantages Theater here in Salt Lake. And that word refinement is used over and over again. And refinement is important again because the reason why you go to the theater is not just to see a play, not just to see a performance, but to be a part of the larger performance that is society. I think one of my favorite illustrations of this idea is this painting by Mary Cassatt. Many of you know Mary Cassatt. She's an American artist who moves to Paris in the post-Civil War years because her family could no longer afford to live in Philadelphia where they were from. And Paris was actually more affordable than Philadelphia. So here we have Mary Cassatt painting her sister in the loge in a box at the Paris Opera. And as you look at this painting, you look at the woman who's looking out at the audience through these eyeglasses, but then you quickly become aware that you're actually being looked at. This woman, Lydia, Mary's sister, is being observed, or you're being observed by other people in other boxes. And this is what happens at these old theaters, especially one of the principal generators for the theater that Alexander Pantages builds in Salt Lake and others. That's really a theater that references these earlier Baroque 16th, 17th, 18th century theaters that were constructed all over Europe. That's really one of the roots of the vaudeville theaters that Alexander Pantages and other companies, other vaudeville companies built, that they styled their theaters on over the course of the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. When you go to these European theaters today, they're very grand experiences. You know, this is Teatro alla Scala in Milan. They're full of gilded boxes. They're filled with audiences who are very quiet to watch the performance, but that's not how these theaters were experienced when you went to them when they were new buildings. Teatro alla Scala in Milan was built in about 1778. Shortly after it was built, we have comments by especially foreigners who travel to Italy and attend the opera in Milan and complain about how noisy and loud and raucous the experience of attending the theater there was. Here we have Mary Shelley, famous for writing Frankenstein, complaining about her experience at the Teatro alla Scala in Milan in 1840. This is one of many complaints that are registered about experiencing the theater in this early stage of their histories. Mary Shelley, after attending La Scala Milan, says, "La Scala serves not only as the universal drawing room for all the society of Milan, but every sort of trading transaction, from horse dealing to stock jobbing, is carried on in the pit, so that brief and far between are the snatches of melody one can actually hear." See, it's so loud in La Scala, you can't even hear what's being performed. That's because people didn't go to these theaters to hear what was being performed. They went there to be a part of society, to see and be seen. By the pit, she's referring to this area of the theater labeled on this illustration of this arena as the parquet. This is actually a part of the theater where there were no seats. In fact, this illustration shows how this area worked. People stood. You could only sit if you had a box. If you didn't have a box, you would sit in this parquet, and there was all sorts of goings on taking place even while the performance was occurring. And that's true of all of these theaters. all of these theaters, whether you're in Milan or whether you're in Bologna or whether you're in the Opera of Paris, you have a noisy parquet, or parterre as it's sometimes called. You'd have people in the boxes, and the people in the boxes oftentimes weren't paying more attention to the opera than the people in the parterre or the parquet. In fact, they would solicit women into their boxes. Each of these boxes were themselves their own little stage, and the performance of social identity would take place. As we see here we have a gentleman entertaining, even during the opera, a woman who was summoned from the corps de ballet, the ballet troupe that was performing earlier in the evening, and they're having their own carryings on while other boxes are doing likewise. And this tradition maintains itself clear through the 19th and the 20th century in famous opera houses like the Opera Garnier in Paris. Many of you know this building. Some of you may not be familiar with it. This is the facade. This is the facade of the building here. You have to go through all of this to get to the actual auditorium. Most of this, the front of this building, has nothing to do with performance, has everything to do with entrance and the display of your own self in larger society. Here's an image of this stair hall, which is right here. And of course, there are other fabulous halls to walk through. And all of this was an important backdrop to what society was all about at this period of time. I will say that this was a particularly fraught area of performance, particularly fraught spaces for performance, especially for women. When women went to the opera, they were oftentimes heavily more judged than were men. And I think these three novels from three different centuries illustrate that point. You have Madame de Merteuil from Dangerous Liaisons, who is basically shamed out of society when she shows up at the opera at a point where she really shouldn't. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, when she attends the opera, when again, she shouldn't, because she's in this relationship that is illicit. She's basically shamed, and that starts her decline to ultimate suicide, is how that book ends. I suppose I can spoil the ending of a book that's over 150 years old. And then, of course, you have the beautiful Age of Innocence, one of my favorite novels, where the Countess Olenska, who's the heroine of the book, is also heavily discussed whenever she shows up to the opera and puts herself on display. She's also a woman who takes risks by even appearing in these buildings. And so this is a very fraught space, especially for women, not so much for men, but that's, of course, it's the way things were. So we have one antecedent for the Utah Theater, the Pantages Theater, in these grand buildings, which were much more about sociability, even through the 19th century, than they were about actual artistic performance, you know, which is, of course, in contrast to the spirit of the Eccles, which is solely focused on the artistic experience and not at all on the social experience. We have another route, though, for buildings like the Pantages Theater. And this other route stems out of the revolutions that took place at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, political revolutions, but particularly the Industrial Revolution, which, especially in England, changed the way that society worked. You had, with the Industrial Revolution, people flooding into cities, becoming not agriculturalists, but factory workers. And when these people left the factory, they were hungry for entertainment. They were hungry for an experience that was in high contrast to the miserable experience they had working at the factory for countless hours each day. And there wasn't, beyond the pubs, anything that really received these people and showed them a good time, aside from whatever they could get out of a mug of beer or other sort of liquor. People wanted more than that. So pubs started to add on in their backs, to their sides, wherever they had room, small stages where the population could be entertained by a song or a dance. And gradually, people started to come to the pubs just as much for the beer, for the song and dance, as they did for the beer or the wine or whatever they were drinking. And you had institutions therefore develop into performance halls, or music halls is what they were called, which provided people with ample opportunity to hear performances, to carouse, to talk with their friends in this ambulatory area. So many theaters took this, this form that I have here marked out in blue. Huge ambulatory where people could walk around and talk, and a seating area where people also could talk and engage with each other while drinking and eating. And of course, there was something happening on the stage at the same time. The mother of all these music halls is the famous Eagle Music Hall, which was just outside of London. It was really the first of these music halls to develop this recipe for entertaining the masses with lots of drink and lots of song and lots of entertainment. It was so famous that it actually was honored with a reference in this Pop Goes the Weasel song that many of us, heard while we were growing up and sing to our children today. Up and down the city road, in and out the Eagle. That's the way the money goes, Pop Goes the Weasel. Unfortunately, the Eagle no longer stands. It was taken over by the Salvation Army in an attempt to cleanse this house from all of its sin. It was considered a den of iniquity for people who were not comfortable with the idea of these music halls supporting, drunkenness and other vices. And then the Salvation Army ultimately tore it down. But this was really where this tradition, this wonderful tradition of music halls in England took place, and it launched the careers of so many famous people, including Champagne Charlie. Champagne Charlie and the great Victor was his competitor. Champagne Charlie was this toff, or this upper class English person who would slum it, right, with the common people and perform songs and talk about his sexual conquests and drink only Moet champagne. The great Victor, his competitor, would only drink Clicquot. So there was a lot of branding competition happening in these early performances. But Champagne Charlie was a big act, and so was Miss Vesta Victoria with this little song for pretty children, Daddy Wouldn't Buy Me a Bow Wow. She would stand on the stage and sing about how sad it was that she only had a pussycat and not a dog. And of course, all of this is full of sexual innuendo, and people loved it. How did all of this get to the United States? It really took this man, Tony Pastor, who traveled to England, got a sense of these music halls and how profitable they were, and then brought them to the United States. And Tony Pastor's music hall in the basement of Tammany Hall, if any of you know anything about Gilded Age New York and the political structure of the city, Tammany Hall is where the power lay. And so he was in the basement of Tammany Hall. He was with the most powerful people in New York, entertaining them in this basement of this building that represented basically the whole political structure of New York. And Tony Pastor's was a big hit. If any of you know the lyrics, how does it go? From, I think that's Put On Your Sunday Clothes from Hello Dolly. We'll join the Astors at Tony Pastor's, the sign positive love, and we won't come home until we've fallen in love. And that's an ode to Tony Pastor's and the role that he played in bringing this new form of entertainment across the Atlantic to New York. But then other people, of course, caught on. If you have a good idea, it's not going to stay just under your control, it's going to spread. And we have other impresarios like the Keith, B.F. Keith, who built a fabulous theater in Boston, Massachusetts, where you would go to see a new art form called vaudeville. And this was an art form that really emerges out of Tony Pastor's performances. Tony Pastor sometimes delved into the burlesque and the raw and the raucous. That was not B.F. Keith's idea. He wanted families to attend his theaters and get a good sense of modern performance and keep it clean and keep it tidy. This is a place he'd want you to be able to take your mother. And one of the big things that he did in designing his theater, whether it be the one in Boston or the various others he constructed around the country, is he made them lavish. he made them refined. All of these potted plants, all of these gilded chairs, all of this decoration would be reassuring to a late Victorian Edwardian audience who would come to this theater and feel like they had entered the palace, a noble space, and be reassured by the surroundings and the fittings that they were not, what would we say, slumming it, but rather entering into a respectable venue. And of course, you have to remember that theaters up to this point had that tinge of irrespectability, of maybe being a little bit on the edge of society. And what Keith's project was to center these theaters very much in the heart of mainstream middle-class America, this middle class that was forming out of, the industrial processes and jobs and economies that were changing the way society worked and functioned. And of course, these theaters were very much buildings that referenced in their actual performances the music halls of England and Europe and Tony Pastor's, but in their fittings, these Baroque opera houses of Europe that we've already discussed. So I think the idea of vaudeville is something that we're all familiar with, but we don't really know. So what I did is I brought a bill from this Palace Theater that Keith constructed in Boston to give you a sense of what you would see if you showed up for one of his performances. We would start out with the orchestra, and then we go down to Al, after a few other acts, Al Mux, a famous pitcher of the Brooklyn National Champions. He was a baseball star who had a golden tenor voice, is how it's described. And so on the off season, when he's not playing baseball, he goes on the vaudeville circuit and performs before audiences across the country. And then we have a few other acts that were probably so-so, they were probably fine. And then we pick up again after the intermission with some heavy hitters. Ethel Levy would be something you'd want to stay around with. Then we kind of relax, we sort of slow things down until we reach the exit march. And so we have peaks and valleys of interest. This would have been a big act. This person would have been a big act. Ethel Levy would have been a big act, but we have a lot of filler material in between. And a lot of that filler material, I should emphasize, was what we would call racist today. We have a lot of filler material that makes fun of immigrants. Here, for example, is an illustration of a vaudeville act that made fun of Irish people. Poor people were targets of the vaudeville, especially the filler acts. We have George Alexander as the tramp. We have people down the street dressing in exotic costumes, pretending to be Chinese or from some foreign place. Then, of course, we have acts with African Americans. Oftentimes, these acts, though, did not feature African Americans per se, but people in blackface. So a lot of these acts we would consider to be problematic. But this is what the filler would be in between the big acts. And so what you would do is you would come for the big acts, and then you may exit out into the hallways and talk with your friends during the lesser attractions. Then you go back for the big acts. And there was constant give and take and ebb and flow with the audience in the theaters during these performances. Of course, this catches on. We have Keith that starts these theater chains. He starts his first theater in Boston, but then creates a network of theaters where all of these various acts can go on the road. Once they played out in one town, they could move on to another, and another set of acts could replace them, so that there's always something fresh and new on the stage. Then we have the Orpheum theater chain, the RKO theater chain, and of course, ultimately the Pantages. And all of these theater chains use vaudeville, elements of burlesque, variety of ragtime, but all of these elements and even more. Songs, dance, theatrical performances would come together to create the vaudeville performance. And these acts would run all day. And we have articles, for example, this is one from the Pantages Theater here in Salt Lake, that you had 3 shows daily. And you could stay all day in the Pantages Theater or the Keith Theater or the Orpheum Theater if you wanted. You didn't actually have to leave when the exit march was played. You could literally spend from morning to noon to night in these theaters and never leave. Of course, that then transitions us to talk about Alexander Pantages. And this man had, I'm not sure I've ever met anyone quite like him. To study his life is fascinating. He had chutzpah, he had courage, he was an amazing businessman, perhaps the sort of human being you wouldn't necessarily want to get into business with. It's really quite an amazing sort of American story in both ways, good and bad. His life is so complicated, what I decided to do is just try to sum it up on one PowerPoint slide. So here we go. Alexander Pantages, as some of you may know, was Greek. He actually called himself the Greek king, or the King Greek was his favorite nickname for himself. He's born on a Greek island called Andros. Andros is one of those desert islands in the middle of the Aegean Sea that you would love to visit, but perhaps not live in, especially if you're Alexander Pantages. Alexander Pantages, from the get-go, had ambitions that were far bigger than this little island on which he was born. His father, for better or for worse, was a storekeeper on Andros. And so his father, because of his role as storekeeper, would oftentimes visit port cities in and around the Aegean, in and around the Mediterranean. And it was on a trip with his father to Cairo when Alexander Pantages was 9 years old, that Alexander decides to abandon his father, ditch his family, and go off and seek his fortune. So at age 9, he runs away from his father, he jumps aboard a steamship and ends up in Central America, digging the Panama Canal, while the French were digging the Panama Canal. And any of you who know anything about the French efforts to dig the Panama Canal know that they were terribly unsuccessful. In part because most of the workers who were digging the Panama Canal died of malaria. The mosquitoes were horrible. And at some point after Alexander Pantages had been digging the Panama Canal, still as a very young boy, he is told in no uncertain terms that if he hangs around the Panama Canal, he too will die. So getting that warning into his head, he jumps aboard another steamship and ends up in San Francisco. There he works as a bartender, there he works as a janitor, he does odd jobs. But in the process, he learns that there is real money to be had up in the Yukon because of the gold rush that is taking place at the Yukon, in the Yukon at that time. So he jumps aboard another steamship, heads up to the Yukon, is not given admittance into the Yukon because he's got no passport, he's got no country to claim, and he has no papers. He's just this nobody from nowhere that the Canadian officials ultimately decided they do not want to allow into the Yukon. So Alexander Pantages, being the sort of person he is, decides, well, if I can't get into the Yukon on my own terms, I'm going to bring a group with me and claim I'm a guide who can usher people into the Yukon territory over the mountains and cliffs and ice fields and rivers that one has to traverse in order to get from Alaska into the Yukon territory. So he pretends to be a guide, and he barely makes it with his group alive into the Yukon territory. When he gets into the Yukon territory, he quickly learns, as most smart miners do, that the real money to be had in these gold bonanza areas is not finding gold in them that are hills, but serving the people who do that mining. He becomes a bartender, and through that process meets Kathleen Rockwell, who calls herself Klondike Kate. And the two of them fall in love. And the two of them decide to open up their first theater / brothel / dance hall together. So with Klondike Kate, with his partner, they open up this hall and become wildly wealthy. We have miners showering Klondike Kate and all of her girls with gold every night. Alexander Pantages is running the bar, overcharges for watered down wine and all those sorts of tricks, and they make a lot of money. When it's time for them to leave the Yukon, Alexander Pantages promises Kathleen Rockwell, Klondike Kate, that he will marry her. So with that promise, Klondike Kate hands her pile of gold, of Yukon gold, over to Alexander Pantages, and he takes it and moves to Seattle. And there he builds the first Pantages Theater in Seattle. And shortly after he has spent Klondike Kate's money on this theater, he writes her and tells her, I've married someone else. I've married a woman named Lois Mendenhall, and you're out of luck. This, of course, breaks Klondike Kate's heart. She tries to sue him. Ultimately, she only recovers $5,000 from her vast fortune, and she has to say goodbye to her dreams of life with Alexander Pantages. Alexander Pantages' vaudeville music hall in Seattle does well. At this point in time, like I've already discussed, Keith and the Orpheum and all of these other circuits are developing, and he says, that is what I want to do with the Pantages name. I want to develop it into a vaudeville circuit. And so that's what he does. He hires the architect, Marcus Proteca, who is a Scottish immigrant, to design these theaters. The first really big production of a theater is built in the Seattle-Tacoma area. And from then on, he expands into Los Angeles, into, I think it's Butte, Montana was the second theater. Ultimately, of course, he eventually gets to Salt Lake. When he gets to Salt Lake, he buys a share of the Casino Theater. He makes it the Pantages Theater, but this theater isn't as much as he would want it to be. It's not a theater that he designed. It's not a theater that really fits his own specifications. And so, of course, then he starts building in the early 1920s, our own Salt Lake Pantages Theater. And being frugal, what he does is he takes 3 pioneer era buildings and fuses them together into the Utah Theater. So this is actually not just one building, it's 3 that have been unified. We hire, of course, Marcus Proteca to do the work. We have artwork, paintings, ceiling paintings, for example, of clouds, of sunsets and things like that by the artist Anthony Heisenberger. We have a wonderful plaster worker, Morgan Alfred Davies, who does a lot of Pantages theaters, but also works in the Salt Lake City and Mesa LDS temples, Masonic Temple here in Salt Lake. A lot of his work is found in the Utah State Capitol. So a lot of local craftsmanship is found in this building, not just imported talent from Seattle or Los Angeles or elsewhere. And that's what we see today in the building, even what survives of it. All of this is handiwork that was quite costly to do, or at least was quite costly even in the standards of the time, and then today would be extremely expensive to replicate. So here are some of the spaces. I think most of you are familiar with what the theater looked like once upon a time, what it looks like today. This, of course, is a version of our Salt Lake Theater. This is, I believe, the Tacoma Theater, which is a copy of ours. There's a copy of the Salt Lake Theater in Tacoma and also a similar building in the Minneapolis area. And fully restored, this is what our theater would have looked like. When it was new, this is what it would have looked like. This gorgeous, gorgeous plaster decoration, gorgeous trompe-l'oeil paintings everywhere. It would have been quite something. So we open the theater, we celebrate it. It's run as a Pantages Theater through most of the 20s. While our theater is running at full steam, Pantages himself is running at full steam. The end of the 20s, he constructs what he considers to be his masterpiece theater. Again, he's using his architect, Marcus Proteca, to design the Hollywood Pantages Theater. He did have an earlier theater in and around Hollywood, but this would be the ultimate statement of his triumph as a theater impresario. When this is done, this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful Art Deco theater, when it's finished, everybody shows up. I show up, Edward Sandstrom shows up, Mia Nadeo shows up. All of us were there. All the big stars were there. Everybody was there save one person. When this opened on June 4th, 1930, and that one person who did not attend the opening of this masterpiece, Pantages Theater, was Alexander Pantages himself. Because shortly before this theater opens, Alexander Pantages is charged with rape. He is charged with raping a dancer in his circuit, a woman named Eunice Pringle. One of the biggest debates about Alexander Pantages' life is if he really did rape this girl. I think that something improper probably happened, but in the lead up to the trial and the staging of the trial itself, there were also other forces at play. There was a lot of anti-immigrant discourse centered around Alexander Pantages. He was an immigrant. He was actually he spoke with, from what I understand, very heavy accent. He could not read. He was illiterate for his entire life. And I think certain people were jealous of his success, and they were anxious to pull him down. He was not a man without enemies, even in Hollywood. People like William Randolph Hearst, who I have pictured here, or Joseph Kennedy, father of John Kennedy, the president, are suspected of trumping up the charges so that Alexander Pantages would fall. And that's ultimately what happens. After he goes through this trial, he's really shamed, and he loses control of his theater empire as a result. And it also doesn't help that his wife, a month after he's charged with rape, runs over somebody and kills them. So the family is besought with legal problems, legal expenses at the end of the 20s into the 30s, and they lose control quickly of their theater empire, including the theater here in Salt Lake. It becomes the Orpheum through the 30s. Alexander Pantages does try to buy it back, but he's never successful. After this charge of rape is centered on him and he loses his reputation, he really is for the most part forced to retire to Southern California, where he spends the end of his life gambling on horses, on racehorses. So at that point in time, the theater starts to change hands. It goes through the Orpheum circuit, and then the Orpheum circuit is extinguished, and then it changes hands several times over the course of the mid-20th century. Ultimately, vaudeville falls out of favor, and it's transformed into a movie house. It's transformed into a movie house again around the midpoint of the 20th century, when people are really abandoning inner cities. Main streets are giving way to subdivisions. One of my favorite illustrations of the suburbanization of Utah is what happened with the governor's mansion. Here we have this beautiful Beaux-Arts governor's mansion, this Gilded Age building on South Temple. And ultimately the governor, I think it's J. Bracken Lee, decides he doesn't want this Victorian pile. He wants a ranch house out in the suburbs. And so the governor's mansion becomes a ranch house out in the suburbs, and it remains that way into the 70s. We have different types of movie experiences. We have outdoor theaters. We have theaters attached to new shopping centers. At the same time all this is happening, the studio system breaks down. Studios would only show up in the first part of the 20th century. They would only show the movies they had produced in theaters that they owned. And this breaks down in the midpoint of the 20th century. And so all of these movies now are up for grabs. Now, gradually, the Utah theater starts to lose a lot of its luster because of all these forces at play. The facade, the original beautiful 1920s facade, is modernized. I still think this facade is very handsome, especially when it's complete with its blade sign. It's a lovely facade. But the building is modernized on the exterior, but also on the interior. And these changes are a little less sympathetic. Well, not just a little, quite a bit more sympathetic. Here we have what our theater looks like today. Here we have the Tacoma Theater in all its full glory. What happens to the Salt Lake Theater, of course, in the midpoint of the 20th century is that the theater is divided into two, right at the balcony line, right here. A floor is extended all the way out to the proscenium arch, and the theater is divided so that they can do what is called piggybacking. They can have a movie viewing here in the lower floor of the theater while another movie plays above. And hence this floor extends all the way out where originally there would have been nothing but open space. My experience with the Utah Theater, my personal experience, really is in the early 90s when it was operating as a children's theater, as the house of Salt Lake City's repertory theater for children. I remember entering this hall. I remember being super impressed by all of its beauty, its stunning, glorious beauty. It was still intact at that time. Unfortunately, after the city rep was asked to leave the building in the 90s, it was transferred over to Howa Construction. And Howa, I'm not sure what their intent was with the building, but in trying to restore it or doing whatever they were trying to do with it, they dug deep holes into the halls of the theater and also into the lobby area. So a lot of this original plasterwork, which was still there in the 90s, I saw it personally because I went to these city rep performances, started to disappear, and bit by bit, the theater was eaten up. That sort of leads us then to the more recent history of the theater. Howa Construction hands over the theater in 2010 to the RDA. I think one of the most interesting questions is why the RDA decided to take on the theater in the first place. I think the idea was initially to make it into the Broadway style theater that ultimately the Eccles Theater has become. But anyone who studies even cursorily the architecture of the Utah Theater could see that it would never play that role. Vaudeville theaters had shallow stages. They didn't need a lot of scenery to do those song and dance style performances. Vaudeville theaters could make do with a table, a chair, and a light bulb. So you didn't have the deep stage, you didn't have loading docks that are required for a lot of the big performances like Hamilton, a lot of scenery, a lot of complicated scenery. All of that wasn't really a possibility for the Utah Theater. So why the RDA even decided to pick it up is a good question. It is a distressed property. It was then, it is now, but there are other distressed properties along Main Street that the RDA never purchased. And so why they even decided to do this is a question I would like to see addressed more thoroughly than it has been. But when the RDA picked it up, the idea was to preserve it. I think that was the idea under the Becker administration for the most part. And then Jackie Biskupski takes over. And ultimately, this theater becomes something under Jackie Biskupski. Mayor Biskupski goes from something to preserve to something that needs to be offloaded. Where where Preservation Utah stepped in with this most recent campaign was in 2018, where we advocated for its preservation. We advocated for at least the public to have a role in deciding the fate of the theater. But ultimately, those advocacy efforts came to naught because the administration decided that they were just going to get rid of the theater, and they started to work heavily with LaSalle and Hines, the two property owners on either side of this building, to plan a new building for the site. And that was a disappointing decision. Ultimately, the city decided not to take this up, though. According to Jackie Biskupski, the citizens of Salt Lake did not care enough about historic preservation, at least to fund this effort. The Salt Lake County also refused to pick it up. And that is where we are today. I'm happy to answer more questions about the state of the theater and my personal experience in advocating for saving this building, even taking meetings with Mayor Biskupski and the RDA and all the other parties that were involved. But for now, I'll just leave it there. I do want to say, if the theater is torn down, and it very probably will be, because when in 2019, the Biskupski administration signed the legal agreements to hand the theater over to Hines and LaSalle, those agreements were quite binding. So in anticipation of this building's demolition sooner or later, I do want to remind people that this is not the only valuable theater that we've lost. One of the buildings I would ask for back if I had an opportunity to do so would be the Old Salt Lake Theater, which is a pioneer era structure that we still celebrate today by continually copying it. We have at least 2 other buildings that reference very directly the architecture of the Salt Lake Theater. But there is this beautiful plaque that marks the spot of the Salt Lake Theater that has a wonderful poem that I would like to now dedicate to the Utah Pantages Theater. The last verse of this poem, called Farewell, is featured on the plaque there on State Street in First South. And it reads, "Long, long be my heart with such memories filled, like the vase in which roses had once been distilled. You may break, you may shatter that vase if you will, but the scent of the roses will hang around it still." With that, I am glad to open up to questions.
Amazing. Thanks so much, David. We did have some questions that popped through in the chat during the presentation, but just as a reminder, please put any questions you have in the chat and I'll make sure David has a chance to answer those. Someone was wondering, and I put in the chat the 3D rendering, but they were wondering if you knew if any elements were going to be saved of the building. And if so, maybe you could speak to that a little bit more.
So as part of the agreement with Hines and LaSalle that the City Council, the Mayor Biskupski, and the RDA worked out, is that elements of this theater would be saved. I think that for the most part, those elements include the stained glass skylight in the auditorium. If we go back here, this thing here, bits of the plasterwork will be saved. Perhaps elements of the mechanics of the theater, pulleys and ropes, might be saved as well. The problem with saving a lot of what this theater makes this theater interesting and really delightful to tour is that plasterwork, though, and that plasterwork is so fragile. It's very difficult to save an element like this intact. And part of the problem too is that the building that is planned to replace the Utah Theater is a very contemporary building. So what do elements like this or this molding really have to do with that contemporary design? I think that the decision to include the architectural salvage in the agreement was to make people feel better that elements, the most important elements of this theater, would be preserved. But I'm really doubtful that we'll see many of those elements, actually, especially in the new building that will take the place of the theater. And I think that's very disappointing. I think the decision to include these architectural elements was a political decision and not really a practical one. So I would expect to see less than more of this building recycled in the skyscraper that will likely take its place or elsewhere around town.
Great. Kind of going off of that, I think this whole experience has really shed some light on the public process. And I'm assuming, everyone here cares about the Utah Theater, but I hope would also care about preservation. So, someone was asking about, they still have hope for the theater if there's recommendations that you think they could do, but I guess I would also extend that out of what can people do that are here today, and when they're talking with people, how can they make preservation an important point to our elected officials and to the people who make these decisions, that made this decision for all Salt Lake City residents.
Yeah, well, maybe to even expand that question a bit, I think a lot of people lately have asked why Preservation Utah hasn't been more vocal in advocating to save the theater even this year. Really, what Salt Lake City did in 2019 in signing this theater off to Hines was quite binding. I mean, legally, Salt Lake City would be in super hot water if they walked away from that agreement, which was signed with all sorts of legal clauses, as most all real estate transactions are. So really, this preservation issue has now become a political issue. If you feel like preservation is something that you feel strongly about, you'd like to see more of, then what we need to do as a preservation community is make it an issue when people go up for elected office when they declare their candidacy for elected office. According to Mayor Biskupski, again, preservation was not a concern. Her idea was that preservation was not a real concern for people of Salt Lake. I think that going forward, we need to make sure that all of our elected officials, both in the civic level, but also on the state level, understand that local heritage is important, that we all care about the built environment, and we need to make preservation more of a political issue that all serious candidates need to have an opinion on, one way or the other. And they need to state those opinions, and they have to, make it part of their platform. So that's what I would do, is I would just ask people to become more politically involved, even from the get-go with the people that we put into office. That is really where this whole effort to save future buildings needs to begin.
Yeah, and I would hop in, get involved with us as an organization, get involved with, the local, community groups, that whether it's 2 people or if you have a local historic society, there's at the very small and at the state level. So there's lots of ways to make your voice heard and to compound that interest. We had someone else asking about, the mentality in the US of just destroying, what's old. And, if you compare that to Europe, it's still pretty young by European standards. And I don't know if you have any comments about that mentality, within the culture, but maybe you could also speak, because I think there's a lot of confusion on what protects a building. People hear it's listed on the National Register, it's safe. And that's a pretty big misconception. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the mentality, and then what are the actual laws or policies in place in Salt Lake and Utah, but nationally as well, that actually ensures that buildings stay saved.
Yeah, I think generally, and I don't mean to sound unpatriotic or like I dislike the United States by criticizing our culture, but I think generally speaking, we are a disposable society, and we see things in terms of disposability. And I think we need to change. I think globally, the world needs to consider the way we dispose, especially of buildings. I can't remember the percentage, but there's a vast percentage of what actually takes up space in the Salt Lake County landfill is demolition rubble and debris. A shocking percentage of what fills up our landfills is that. I think globally there is a big push to change, and I hope that push takes root here in the United States and in the Western United States more specifically. I am encouraged that the Pritzker Prize for Architecture, and the Pritzker Prize for Architecture is sort of the Nobel Prize for the field of architecture, this year went to a couple who have never built a new building in their lives. They're long-time architects who've designed all sorts of buildings, but they've never built a new one. They have only renovated existing buildings to make them better. And that mentality I would like to see really take root, and it needs to take root. We cannot afford to throw away as we have in the past up through the present. In terms of what protects a building, there are really 2 lists that exist in Salt Lake or in other communities across Utah that can protect buildings. One is the National Register. And the National Register really does 3 things. It acknowledges on a national level, it's a list. The National Register is a list of important buildings kept by the National Park Service. The National Register first acknowledges that buildings are worthy of saving by documenting their history, by recording how they've evolved over time. National Register nominations indicate that a building on that register is of worth, of note, for whatever reason, and is worthy of saving. But it does not actually save the buildings. All it does is allow you to register the building's history and put up a plaque if you'd like, and apply for tax credits if you like, historic preservation tax credits. The only list in Salt Lake or other communities across Utah that really matter in terms of actually preserving a building is the local civic list. If you go on to the city's historic preservation webpage, the Salt Lake City does have one, you can pull up the list of districts, of local historic districts that have been designated in Salt Lake, and also a list of individual buildings that have been designated as worthy of preserving. And by no means are all the important historically or architecturally interesting buildings in Salt Lake on those lists. Actually, very few are. Very few important neighborhoods are captured in our existing historic districts, but it's those buildings on that list, neighborhoods on that list, that get design review, that have to go through landmarks, that have to jump through several hoops before they are ultimately demolished, if that indeed is the direction that the building owner wants to go with the building. Is that clear as mud? Does anyone have any follow-up questions on that?
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And so correct your friends when you say it's on the National Register, it's safe. It just is recognizing its significance. So we need to make sure that places are actually listed within the state. We did have someone at the beginning, you mentioned the Draper prison. And I think this goes back to just this idea of, you know, as a culture, like what is worth preserving and why we're making the choices. So can you maybe talk a little bit more about that? I mean, it's very different than theater, but I do think it's important to to talk about the different types of stories that get preserved, and you know why Preservation Utah is actively looking at the prison.
Yeah, well, Preservation Utah is a group. I mean, really in our office, there are only two people, myself and Kelsey, who do advocacy for the entire state. And so when push comes to shove, we have to choose our projects. We can't take on every project that floats by. Simply, we do not have the bandwidth. The prison project was interesting, A, because the local community, the Draper Historic Commission, was interested in saving the building. And B, the reason why we joined that fight was because we feel that the story that the Utah State Penitentiary tells is a complicated story, is one that has not been told, but one that is worth telling, especially as we move into the 20th century, where issues of social justice, of imprisonment, gain higher and higher relief and gain importance. We did have a beautiful prison. Actually, it was a beautiful building. It really was. In Sugar House, that we could have preserved. Ultimately, we didn't. In about 1955, we handed it over to the fire brigade to practice fire control, so the building was ultimately burned. If we had that prison standing today, that would have been the centerpiece of not just Sugar House Park, where the prison stood, but a real landmark for all of Salt Lake, for all of Utah. It would have told a fascinating story for Utah, going back to even the settlement of the state by the first Anglo-American settlers, the Mormon pioneers. I don't want us to make that same mistake with the Draper prison. The Draper prison has as rich a story to tell as that pioneer era prison did. And for that building to survive and tell those stories and be a point of reconciliation, of healing, of social challenge, I think is exactly, you know, what it should be. And unfortunately, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, SOM, who has been handed over the point development, agrees with us. What we are interested in having, though, is people in the local community continue to support the project. So at no point is that prison reclamation cut, which it could easily be at any point. We want as many voices speaking out about the importance of that building as possible. And if you have further questions about reasons why we're supporting the retention of the prison, don't hesitate to reach out. My email is all over, you know, our Preservation Utah webpage. I'm more than happy to walk you through that.
Excellent. Yeah. We had someone ask about going back to the Pantages, and I don't know if you remember specific names, but do you know any of the famous entertainers that maybe frequented or stopped by before it fell on its hard times?
Well, opening night, there was a wonderful quote from, who is that amazing dancer who started actually her own dance troupe in New York and is still going strong. So impressed to see her name. I had no idea. What is her? Fortunately, I can't pull it out of my head. I'm sorry. remarkable people. I mean, everyone talks about Babe Ruth and Abbott and Costello, but all sorts of people, all sorts of wonderful
Was it
entertainers.
Martha Graham?
Martha Graham. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Megan.
Martha Graham was there on opening night. She talked about how beautiful the theater was and how warm the theater felt and how welcome she felt by the audience. It's just amazing. I was sort of shocked that Martha Graham was here in Salt Lake performing at the theater. So there are a number of names that performed on the stage through the 20s and early 30s. But by the time we reach the mid 30s, it really is operating just as a movie house. So its life as a vaudeville theater is short simply because it's really constructed at the end of that vaudeville era.
Excellent. I think we've gotten most of our questions answered. So please put it in the chat. And if I missed it, you can put it again. Please don't be offended. So yeah, I guess I'm not seeing anything coming in. I don't know if you want to, since we're a little over an hour, we can wrap up. I guess just to remind all those listening that we have some great events coming up. Our Historic Homes Tour in September on the 18th, and October 22nd is our Heritage Awards to celebrate the people who are putting in the work and trying to save the great spaces in Utah. So please, I'll put some links in the chat. But maybe, David, you could just give us a little hope. I think, you know, it's tough. It's tough when you have to deal with a place that means so much and, you know, is at risk. And, you know, I think we're all hoping, you know, that it goes well, but it can be hard when you lose these spaces. So what words of hope do you have for us as we leave?
There is still much work to do, and independent of what happens to the Utah Theater, there are still buildings that need saving. There's still a huge swath of Utah's legacy, built legacy, that requires assistance from all of us to secure and save. I maybe that isn't as hopeful as you wanted me to be, Kelsey, but that's sort of my message. And independent of how this goes, the preservation community needs all of us. We are small in a state that has land rights as a cherished section of law, and that has this mentality of, I think, still dispose of it and start again. And with all of us working together, I think we can not only save old buildings, but really make a better Utah in the process on so many levels. And so my encouragement is for you to get involved, like Kelsey suggested, in Preservation Utah, in your local elections and your local civic meetings, landmark commission meetings. Pay attention and raise your voice when we have opportunities to do so through the public process. And I look forward to working with all of you and furthering this effort across the state.
Well, thank you so much, David. This was amazing. My brain is full of information. I put David in my email in the chat, so it's just David or Kelsey at preservationutah.org. We are here. We serve the state. If you have questions, you want to know how you can get involved, if there's things going on in your area, we will try and connect you. If you are doing your own preservation projects, we have a great preservation directory. We do try and offer workshops during times of the year. So we do try and get people engaged in historic preservation as much as possible. So thank you so much again for spending your evening with us.
Thank you all.
Eat and have a wonderful evening. Thanks so much.
Yes, get off Zoom. Thanks all. Take care.